So adrenal fatigue, what are the causes, symptoms, and recovery? My name is Dr. Alan Christianson. I'm a board-certified naturopathic endocrinologist with 30 years of managing adrenal health naturally. And let's talk this through. The first point I'd love to go through is a distinction between adrenal fatigue and adrenal dysfunction. I don't know, I've had mixed feelings about this. So in one sense, it could be almost kind of like pedantic, like I like this term but not that term. But I think it's important because the term adrenal fatigue, it implies misconceptions. And that's why I don't like it. So let me go into that. Adrenal fatigue, the term has been around for about 30 years or so. It's been popularized, and many think about it as being a cause behind fatigue, anxiety, sleep issues, after the effects of chronic stressors. And there's a lot of truth to that. There are things like this that do happen, but the difficulty about the idea behind adrenal fatigue is the thought that the adrenals are fatigued, that stress causes them to make stress hormones, and that a lot of stress would cause them to make a lot of stress hormones, and eventually they get worn out and they can't make enough. That's kind of the idea behind that. And that side of it is not true. And it's important to make that point because if it were true, the solution would be just making more stress hormones. And some have gone so far as to partner with physicians to simply take hydrocortisone because that's a stress hormone. It's one like the body makes. So there are those to where they can do tests and see that their cortisol levels are low, maybe across the board, maybe at certain times of day. And if the premises of adrenal fatigue were true, then just taking more cortisol would solve the problem. And it doesn't, and it's not safe, and it's not healthy. So our bodies are a lot more complicated than that. What we do know happens is that the regulation of the stress response changes under chronic stressors. We have this thing called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So in the brain, we have the hypothalamus and the pituitary. The hypothalamus mostly is measuring all facets of our body's chemistry, and then via the pituitary, it's controlling how we make certain hormones. The adrenals being one of those glands that are making hormones. Well, two of the glands, right? Two of the adrenals, making about 57 different hormones. So what happens though is that under chronic stressors, this HPA axis can work differently. The term used a lot in medical literature has been adrenal dysfunction or adrenal dysregulation, or more commonly, HPA, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal dysfunction or dysregulation. That's a mouthful. So honestly, sometimes these days I will slip into saying adrenal fatigue because people know that what we're all talking about. And the true sides of it are, again, this can come on after chronic stressors. And chronic stressors can mean, a boss who's a jerk, or a difficult schedule, or a strained relationship, those kinds of obvious stressors. But it can also mean things you might not intuitively think of as stressors, like a disordered daily schedule, not getting enough time for sleep, not having steady blood sugar levels. These things are also stressors. And collectively, it's the total amount, the intensity, and the duration of these stressors that can eventually lead to dysfunction. And when we have that, that can cause major symptoms. They can be things like fatigue, the brain fog, the weight gain, anxiety, dizziness, many more. But it can also have big effects upon long-term health. Papers have shown that if the body's cortisol balance, or timing of cortisol throughout the day, if that's not right, that can be a bigger factor for our health than even things like smoking status or cholesterol levels. Now, all these things are important, but the cortisol balance, the adrenal health, it's huge. It can be a bigger factor for early death than nearly anything else. So some misconceptions. The first I mentioned is that how the glands, the thought that they get fatigued. There are times in which they cannot physically make adequate amounts of hormones. Those are rare, and those are not really typical. Even when cortisol is low, it's usually not that the body cannot make it. It's that the body is choosing not to make as much right now. Another big myth is that recovery is all about taking more supplements. They can have a place, but simple elements of lifestyle that we'll talk about are huge factors. We don't often need much for pills. Another big misconception is that if adrenal fatigue or stress is the cause of a lot of symptoms, you're stuck with that. And this is going to be going on for quite a long time. It's just not true. If you do the steps that we'll talk about, some basic things that are helpful, it doesn't have to last long. It can go away for quite a short amount of time, even rarely more than several months. So some of the big factors, again, that get behind this, chronic stressors that I mentioned, poor sleep, talked about that. Dietary factors, not eating regularly, not getting good amounts of glucose, getting too much highly processed carbohydrate, too much caffeine. We also think about environmental toxicants, training way past one's normal levels in terms of exercise. That can be a factor. And the symptoms that can come are many. I mentioned about fatigue, brain fog. We can also see things like muscle weakness, mood changes like anxiety, irritability, mood swings, weight gain, especially mid-body weight gain, and then cravings, specifically those for salt. Those are often big signs of there being adrenal issues. And this can then correlate with changes in cortisol output. When cortisol levels are not regulated well, we can be more vulnerable to infections, more apt to develop chronic fatigue. And symptoms can be more specific as well, such as dizziness or lightheadedness from getting up quickly, especially when these symptoms show on at certain times of day, when they're recurrent at key times of day. So how do we know this is happening? Well, it's good doing a couple of steps, one of which is being aware of symptoms, knowing when they happen, and if it's suspicious that they're following a rhythm and they are like some of the ones we've spoken about, then the options can be first self-assessment. So adrenalquiz.com is one good resource. This is also the quiz from the Adrenal Reset Diet book, and that can help you know if symptoms are based upon the specific ones and the scoring of them likely pointing towards adrenal issues. There's also medical testing. Now, there's two facets of this. There's tests that show if the adrenals are diseased, and there's tests that show if they're dysfunctional. The tests for disease are primarily blood tests, and these look at cortisol. These should also look at ACTH. These can show if the glands are making way too much or way too little cortisol. What they can't show, however, is how cortisol is timed throughout the day. And this is one case where salivary tests are really helpful because they can show you how the morning free fraction of cortisol compares against the nighttime free fraction of cortisol. And that's the real defining characteristic of the HPA imbalance that I mentioned before. Now, if this is off, what can you do about that? Well, there's really good data that timing of carbohydrates makes a big difference. So it's not so much you've got to avoid carbs at some times, it's more so you've got to include carbs, especially with your evening meal. So why would this matter? Well, because cortisol, the main adrenal hormone, is a glucocorticoid. It is a blood sugar regulating hormone, first and foremost. Now, if our carbohydrate intake is below a certain threshold, our body can still keep our blood sugar up just fine, but it does that by using cortisol. And cortisol makes our muscle tissue stored proteins into blood sugar. So if that's happening later in the day, that doesn't allow for that normal nighttime decrease of cortisol. It won't wind down as it should later in the day. So the trick there is having healthy, good, slow-burning carbs that are rich in glucose. Now, what does that mean? Lots of good options: starchy vegetables, sweet potatoes, also things like plantains, lentils, brown rice, quinoa, other good vegetables such as potatoes or squash. These are all dense sources of glucose, and as such, they can give us gentle increases of glucose in our bloodstream that don't require a lot of insulin to process, but do allow for cortisol to stay lower. And then also adding in healthy foods that keep blood sugar steady and make us not need to rely on cortisol as much for regulating blood sugar. Some great ones here include resistant starch, high fiber veggies, and then balancing the amount of proteins and healthy fats with the meals. Other steps that help, sleep hygiene, keeping a regular schedule, especially when we wake up, super important. Getting bright light exposure in the morning, minimizing light exposure at night. Doing habits to minimize stress, mindfulness, yoga, meditative practices, having regular downtime. And then not relying upon stimulants for energy. Caffeine can give you energy, but it's kind of like credit card debt. You're really just borrowing from tomorrow's energy. You're not getting more energy today. You're just getting advance on tomorrow. So it's going to come back with interest. And then exercise is critical. So the right amounts are helpful. The wrong amounts are counterproductive. And none is the most common wrong amount, or too little. So I want to put that out there. It's easier to get too little than too much. Too much is really just what your body is used to. There's no specific amount that's always going to be problematic. It's if you're doing way more than you've done in the last several weeks, then it's a problem. So you can train hard, it's not a bad thing, but you want to work up to that over longer periods of time. And then what are some other things that can help? Nutrients make a big difference. There's a lot of good adaptogens, holy basil, rhodiola, ashwagandha. These are nice things used in combinations to help the body balance cortisol better. Magnesium is a nutrient that many can run low in, as are B vitamins, vitamin C, and essential fats. These are good things that control inflammation, help the body have a better stress response, and limit the harms of stress upon the brain. So if you're doing all this right, what should you expect? Things should change quickly. You should expect no more than a few weeks to see a clear, measurable change in mood, in energy levels, in food cravings. They should go down really fast when you're moving in the right direction. Measurable change in terms of changes in salivary or blood levels of cortisol, that shouldn't take more than several months. If there's no change at all in 3 months, something's not right, and it's time to really revisit the strategies and or what could be holding you back. And then in terms of being healed, being stabilized, being back on track again, honestly, no matter how bad this is, doing the right things, that shouldn't take more than 6 months. It just doesn't have to take all that long. This is a very real issue. It has big effects upon your symptoms and your long-term risks, but it is reversible. That's the big takeaway, is this is something you can do a lot about. Please consider the Adrenal Reset Diet as a great resource. I've talked a lot about how you can know which stages you're in, what are the most specific things you can do per those stages, and some guidance along the way. But be aware of your adrenal health. It's a critical thing for your well-being, and you can take control over that. All right, Dr. Christianson here with you. Take great care.